Hello, and welcome to the Enterprise Automation Excellence Podcast, hosted by Enterprise Management Associates. As a leading IT analyst firm, we provide deep insights across IT and data management technologies. In this podcast, we explore how automation drives business processes, analytics, development, and infrastructure. Join hosts Dan Twing and Tom O'Rourke as they discuss the evolving automation landscape, share strategies to optimize your tools, and guide strategic decisions for your automation portfolio. Now, let's dive into the world of automation excellence.
Hello, and welcome to the Enterprise Automation Excellence Podcast. I'm Dan Twing, and I'm here with my co-host Tom O'Rourke. And today we're going to talk about automation myopia, or when you have too narrow of a problem definition, it might cause you to pick the wrong tool. I was recently with a organization, a large fast food chain in this case, talking about automation tools and collecting sales data from all of their different stores and processing that data into their central data warehouse. And they were looking at a large workload automation and orchestration type tool, but their architect, he's defined the solution set that he thinks something like an Airflow or a Dagster is sufficient for their data pipeline needs. And it caused me to think about, well, what problem are you trying to solve? If you just are trying to move the data into the warehouse and that's the end of the process, those tools might be sufficient. But probably there's a lot more surrounding that process. And if you define the process more broadly, you can track each step. And really, this gets into orchestration. But if you don't orchestrate, if you don't define the problem broadly enough, then there's less to orchestrate and you're still leaving gaps in the process, I guess is my thinking. And the right tool is going to depend on how you define the problem. Tom, you certainly have some experience with talking to folks on this level. You know, if you define the problem too narrowly, you end up with a bunch of point solutions that are disconnected.
I will say that this is a repeating scenario that I have not just seen in automation, but I've seen in enterprise technology throughout my career. That from the perspective of a single project, a single technology team, and even a single business owner, there's a narrow view of what are the requirements that need to be addressed. But many of those cases, there are other requirements that haven't been considered that may make a data pipeline solution like Dagster, like Airflow, a less suitable way to go and solve the problem. In historical terms, back in the 90s, I was head of architecture at a financial services firm, and I would have teams come and say, hey, we want to go and build on this technology and go and deploy it. We're going to put it into production. It's going to be used by the business 24 hours a day, every business day. And my first question was, okay, great. You're building on a specialized technology. Are you going to be sharing pagers in order to figure out who's going to solve the problem when something goes wrong? And it will. Because if you use one of the technologies that we already have in our portfolio, there is already an operations center. It already works 24/7, and it will save you from getting calls when things go bump in the night.
And, it might make sense to utilize an Airflow or a Dagster, but you may still want to wrapper it with a broader orchestration and automation tool so that you can see the process end to end. You can wrapper that point solution inside the broader automation and still get all the benefits. You don't necessarily have to handle that file transfer natively inside the workload or give up some of the other features of something like a Dagster and Airflow. If that's what the data team is comfortable with, they may solve that part of the problem with that tool. Doesn't change the benefits you would get from thinking about it more broadly and using the broader orchestration tool to tie that step together with the steps preceding it and the steps following it.
Yes, and I think first looking at the problem itself, it's important to expand the discussion from, hey, I've got this cool tool and it meets my technical requirements, to a conversation about the operational requirements, the business requirements, the legal and regulatory requirements, the other elements that are going to be important in an enterprise business.
Well, one of the big ones is SLA management, right? Or just awareness. The point solution may do quite well at the actual activity of collect the data once it's available, but what has to happen to get it in that availability state is kind of outside of its purview. And then move it here into the warehouse with these steps, whether that has anything to do with any kind of data cleaning or reformatting, whatever that process looks like, it can finish, but it has no awareness of any SLAs tied to that process or the broader downstream processes that depend on that data. Whereas that's where something like a workload automation and orchestration tool brings another layer of awareness around that much bigger process. And if that step affects something else downstream that impacts SLAs, the proper alerting can happen, the proper reporting. Those things are not as automatic if you just use the point solution by itself.
Yes. And so to set up a straw man in this, among the operational requirements are going to be support during the appropriate business windows. Among the business requirements are, how do you handle activities along the business calendar, business or banking holidays as an example in all of this. From a regulatory requirement, this may be a process where there is a need to audit the information, and the logs need to be captured in a form that they can demonstrate that there was no tampering done to the logs. In file transfer, there's a particular need to even go further than that and establish that the transaction took place where the transaction was moving money from point A to point B and assigning it to a set of accounts someplace else. And you want to make sure that you can prove that you sent the money to the other side. You don't want to be held responsible when things get lost. But moving from those requirements, I think where this can steer us is that these solutions for data pipelines like Airflow, like Dagster, work very, very well in a hybrid architecture where they're combined with a workload automation or orchestration solution. And the pipeline tools do what they do really, really well, which is going and defining the pipeline, often graphically, establishing the stages, the handshakes, everything else, and then handing over the responsibilities for the larger set of operational and business controls to the workload automation tool.
It's broader than just data pipelines. I mean, that's a common one we hear a lot these days. And you can certainly see many examples where they got along for maybe a number of years utilizing a Dagster or an Airflow, but they eventually, in my experience, larger enterprises that have these other tools in use for other use cases will eventually realize the gaps in the problems that can arise with the point solution when they're not monitoring that process from beginning to end. And eventually they will bring that into the fold, oftentimes not rewriting the Dagster code, but just wrapping that being more concerned about what happens to get the data to the point that Dagster can get a hold of it, and then what has to happen for users to get usable results out the other end. But it can be broader than just data pipelines. Some other examples might be, take just a business workflow. You might automate a single form. Maybe a developer is asked to help with the process. They automate a single form with an RPA process. They get that part done and automated, but they're not really thinking about all of the other handoffs with that form in the process, any kind of status updates or exception paths. So again, if you bring orchestration to bear, you can think about the very beginning of what triggers the process in the first place and what is the ultimate outcome we're looking at or hoping to achieve. And if you think about it in that way, it makes you think about all those other steps, and that may change which tool or sets of tools that you need to bring to bear to control the process correctly and ensure that it runs consistently.
And it fits with all of the enterprise requirements. It's built to go and fit that purpose. I think we've both seen the workload automation and orchestration space that the enterprise automation tools have leaned into this, and they've built out integrations to other specialized automation tools. It is a very, very common pattern to be able to handle data pipelines, to handle RPA, to handle workflows that happen in database tools in other places. Very common in ERP for there to be a bi-directional management of the flows through the ERP tool, where the ERP tool is going and it is handling the step-by-step task flow through it, and at the same time these steps are visible outside through the enterprise automation tool, which can have a larger view of the end-to-end business process, of which the ERP tool is just a component.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a big component, but it doesn't stand alone. And what is aware of and monitoring all of that connective tissue is really where you can change how often you're successful, right? It's in those gaps where things can get broken or delayed. And if you're not monitoring those gaps, so when you think about what does broad thinking look like then? If you're approaching an automation problem, how do you really think bigger? I think it starts with, you really have to think about the complete end-to-end, from what is the trigger to what is the outcome that's desired. What happens upstream before that data pipeline runs or before that process starts? What often can fail downstream? Who's depending on the end outcome, right? And think about that, the really the end of the process. And if you define it bigger and you understand then all of the intermediate steps, you can make sure that you have the right SLA awareness, the right alerting, so that the process doesn't just, hey, we're really good at moving the data from A to B. Well, what about the rest of the process, right?
Yeah.
I still don't have the report I need as the business user.
Yeah.
Telling me that you've automated one piece of it really well doesn't help me very much,
right,
if I'm at the end of the process.
Yeah, moving the data from A to B is great, but if you're the CFO and the business process that you care about is the end of quarter reconciliation that will allow you as a public company to go and report your results, you're looking for the end-to-end business process at a much higher level than file transfer. And so I think in taking this end-to-end perspective often starts with understanding the business process that is measured by the triggering events. This is the beginning of our end of quarter reconciliation to the business outcomes. We have all the information available in order to be able to go and prepare our public reports.
Right. So if you were going to say to someone, how do you avoid automation myopia, right? How do you avoid defining it too narrowly? First of all, I think a lot of times people approach this and it's like they automate the easiest step first and then they never go further, right? Oh, well, it's really easy to automate this 20% of the process. Let's focus on that. And it may be that that's all that you need to do at that moment in time, but it's still, I think, valuable to understand and map that entire value stream all the way to the outcome flow. And even if then you can acknowledge, well, this 20% is easy to automate. Let's start there. But you can understand and think more longer term about how that might evolve over time when you might automate more parts of that process. But I think even beginning to automate just a piece of it with an understanding of what the full outcome is a good place to begin, even if you can't automate it end to end right from the beginning.
You posed the question of how do you do this? And I think for the central automation team, they need to establish themselves as, a checkpoint in the design review process for these development efforts that come up. Just as there are reviews for cybersecurity, there are reviews for privacy, that automation needs to get in there. They need to ask the questions to make sure that they are able to reflect the full set of enterprise needs to ensure that the full set of enterprise requirements are being met around automation. And then I think there's a second piece, which we really haven't gotten into here, but the centralized automation team often has a responsibility to minimize the number of automation tools that are in use within the organization, that it is better to have 3 or 4 standard automation solutions out there that cover the range of technical and business requirements for automation than to let every group choose its own solution.
There's certainly some best practices and training type benefits to a narrower tool set, right? That you can get some consistency. I mean, even just, you take some of the things that were done, even 5-7 years ago in some of the workload tools to handle large multi-step job streams. And some of the products have things like where you can define a type of workflow once and then leverage that 1,000 times. But if something needs to change in it, you can change it in one place and that core module will change. Or broad naming standards where you can search and replace, and just all of the things that it takes to keep these things tuned and running right over time. If it's defined in 12 different places in 12 different tools, it's a lot more challenging to keep all of the staff on point than if you have a narrower set of tools and some best practice processes that you follow. It's just easier to keep it all tidy and working right.
Yes, if your president signs an executive order that there will be no more daylight savings time, it's great if you only have 2 or 3 places to go and make that change, and difficult if that's spread out over 20 or 30 places in the organization.
Right. And this is, again, a place where that doesn't mean if you have 20 data pipelines running on Airflow or Dagster that you have to necessarily tear that down, but you might want to wrapper them and invoke them from the orchestration tool so that you can understand what has to happen leading up to that pipeline running and what has to happen with the data after it arrives. You might actually redefine the steps inside that other orchestration tool, or you might just bring some of that trigger data to bear so that you're utilizing a central calendar that you can maintain. Something that basic seems so simple, but talk to anybody who does this in a large bank, and I mean, it's not uncommon to have 30 or 40 different calendars for a global bank. I mean, that's a small number actually, with all the different holidays and geographies, different time zones. It can get very complicated to define what is a global organization's business day.
Yes. All right, Dan, any final thoughts?
We've talked about some future episodes, and I don't want to let all of that out, but how you approach what the automation is and thinking bigger end to end, it almost becomes like managing a product. And I know this is near and dear to your heart, and maybe you want to give us a little preview of what you've been thinking down this line, because I think this kind of leads into that, right? How you define the automation and what tools you're going to use to achieve it. If you step back and think about that broader orchestration role, you're managing this over time, and you're bringing more resources to bear as you get more experience. All of that looks a little bit like other kinds of software.
Yes, and the next topic up for us is going to be product thinking for automation. I have been working on this as a deep dive before you went off and had that meeting with the team that talked about their desire to use Dagster and your takeaway from it on understanding the requirements. And I will say core to the product thinking approach is making sure that what you're doing with automation is aligning with the customer and business goals, not just the expressed needs or desired solution, which is often the way that the requirements come into an automation team. And so there's too much to talk about in the wrap up here. For all of you who are listening, you're just going to have to wait till the next episode for that one. But we want to thank everybody who has joined us here today. The podcast is available on all the major podcast syndication networks. You can reach out to Dan and I on LinkedIn, or you can email us at eaepodcast@enterprisemanagement.com. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dan and Tom, for your insights on today's topic, and thanks to our listeners for joining the Enterprise Automation Excellence podcast. If you're a technology or operations leader looking to enhance your automation strategy, stay connected for more expert insights. Visit enterprisemanagement.com to learn how EMA can support your automation initiatives, and check out more episodes for in-depth discussions and industry trends.